Welcome to the Good Reading Podcast, proudly sponsored by Book People Gift Cards. A Book People gift card is the perfect gift for readers of all ages. Simply order your gift card online at bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au. Redeem at any one of over 500 bookshops across Australia. Visit bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au.
Collectively, our family was sort of Mormon. Almost Mormon. Not quite Mormon. Mormonism fell on a spectrum, like autism. Kyle's parents were TBM, true believing Mormons, true blue Mormon, and that's how he was raised. He was a member of the priesthood in high school, could trace his ancestry back to Brigham Young and Joseph Smith, or so his mom said, submitted his mission papers as soon as he was eligible, the whole 9 yards. He served 8 months in South Carolina, came home early, and signed up for an apprenticeship. His parents didn't talk to him for 3 years. No one talked about the unfortunate incident, except for Kyle's occasional remarks that Southern Baptists were bat crap insane. He was a lapsed member and I was OTM, other than Mormon, never a member, which meant our record surely had a note that I was the one who lured him away.
Today I'm talking to Katherine Allum about her 2023 Fogarty Literary Award-winning debut novel, The Skeleton House. Katherine, welcome to the Good Reading Podcast.
Hi there, thanks for having me.
The setting for The Skeleton House is an interesting one. We're in the American Southwest in the fictional town of St. Stephen's. A desert setting always seems appropriate for tensions bubbling beneath the stillness of the surface, as this story does. But St. Stephen's is also a stronghold of the Mormon faith. So I felt like I was getting an insider's view of this cloistered world. Your accent gives something away, but what is your relationship with the world within the Skeleton House?
It is a setting that is very close to home because it is home. I moved to a tiny Mormon town outside of Las Vegas when I was 11. My family moved there and lived there until I graduated high school, and they're still there. I ran away for world adventures, but it is a setting that when I lived there, it drove me nuts. I just wanted to get out. I was bored, wasn't a lot to do. But the more I live my life away from it, the more I keep turning back to it. As you said, the desert setting is such an interesting environment to play with as an author because of the tensions and the isolation, and it's a very, for the desert being a very landscape, it's a very rich environment to set a novel.
Meg, your main character, you introduce her as a fairly complex character existing in a world where she doesn't quite belong. She is the heathen in denim, an OTM. How did she come to be an OTM, and what is an OTM?
OTM stands for Other Than Mormon, and it means people in, it was a phrase actually used in the town I grew up in. It was meant somewhat affectionately. It was always said with this kind of warmth to it. So, you'd be chatting with a group of women at the post office, and we're all collecting our, mail and stuff. It's such a small town that post isn't delivered to houses. We all collect it from central post office. But they'd be chatting and the conversation would lead to some church things, and they would go, "Oh, sorry." And they sort of pat your arm and they say, "You're OTM." And they say, "Well," and then they shift the conversation back. And Meg's character, being an OTM and being in this very isolated community, I like what you said about she does seem like she doesn't really belong here, and she doesn't. And it's not necessarily because she's not Mormon, but she is this incredibly bright and driven person who probably should have been able to get out and experience the world and go to university and pursue those academic and intellectual and creative interests that she has. But due to life circumstances and falling pregnant at 17, she didn't have that opportunity. But as an author, I like to explore what if questions. That's sort of how my stories start. So I guess part of the inspiration for this novel was, what if somebody a little bit like me, who would have either been kind of my best friend or arch nemesis in school, didn't have the opportunities I had, didn't have the support. Meg is not me, but if somebody a bit like me wasn't, kind of given the opportunity to pursue her interests and, kind of see where life took her. and she found herself, in her mid-20s, still there with two kids, and her husband's building their forever family dream home. And she has this moment of clarity where this isn't what she wanted, and she realizes she is going to be stuck in this town forever unless she does something.
So all of this makes her less than the perfect Mormon wife. Her husband, Kyle, almost immediately from the opening pages, there's a sense of disconnect between the two. His idea of spoiling Meg is to buy her a sewing machine.
It is, yeah. Kyle has some very specific views about what a good wife should be. So he is not a present, devout member of the church. He doesn't regularly attend, the church, but he did. He was once very interconnected in that community, and I think he perhaps has this vision that he will return once he gets his lovely little wife and his children convert, and then they can integrate better in the community. I think Kyle has a good many ideas that he doesn't share with Meg, but will attempt to force that upon her.
It all seems happy enough, but it quickly emerges that Kyle is a fairly controlling and even manipulative husband. I think these days we might use the term gaslighting.
Yeah, there is a lot of that in the early pages of the novel. There's a scene in particular quite early on where he sends her on this errand to buy some wire for the house. And she goes and buys the wire, and it is really hectic for her to do because she's got a 5-year-old and an almost 3-year-old in tow. It's, 43 degrees Celsius above, where she is. It's a very hot day. And she buys this wire and she gets it home, and no, she's taken it to the building site even, and she wrestles it out of the car, and she gets home and says, "I've already done it." And he looks at the receipt and he says, "No," he goes, "this is the wrong gauge of wire." And she says, "No, that's what you said." And he says, "No, it's not. You must have misheard me. That's okay. You can return it tomorrow." And she later finds a receipt where she had written the gauge of wire down. And she does think to herself, I never write things incorrectly, where he's definitely made the mistake and he's the one that's misspoken, but he's put it upon her that, no, you're the one who made the mistake.
Nearly everything that Kyle does seems to be aimed at tying Meg to the house. For example, he buys a dog, which she doesn't want, and he's very keen for a third child, which Meg doesn't want. And so there we have even more tension and the tension building right through the book.
Yes. And Kyle, I think at the start of the book, one of the uncomfortable things about this novel is I had to try to get into his head, and getting into the head of an extremely controlling, manipulative human being was not a fun place to live in. But I think in the early stages, he is not intentionally trying to control Meg. He is not thinking this woman's out of control. She needs to be put in her box. And a lot of the sort of undercurrents of extremely conservative America, and small towns, I think anywhere, small religious communities where they follow this very strict patriarchal structure where the man is the head of the household. He makes the decisions, and the wife sits under that, and the children sit under her. So he's making decisions thinking, no, I'm the leader, I'm the head of the household. This is how life should be. This is how marriage should be. This is how families should be, because he's been fed these images and he feels that he must exert that leadership. But when Meg doesn't go along with it and she voices her own views, it's almost like he's a bit baffled and doesn't know what to do with it. So he cracks down harder on what he thinks these views are. And that is, the kind of simmering tension and escalation in the book.
Meg is a good mother to Finn and Hallie. In fact, mother love is one of the things that drives her, despite the world crumbling around her. As I read this book, I wondered what kept this marriage together. Is mother love what keeps this marriage together?
A lot of things keep Meg from leaving Kyle. I don't know if I define that as keeping the marriage together. I think for Meg, it's a lot of where else would she go? There's a huge lack of opportunity, not just in the community she lives in, but she's this young mother with a high school education, and she's got these two small kids. There's no opportunity to access higher education in the town she's in. She'd have to drive 100K, or try to find something online. There are a lot of barriers and limitations. And I think as well, being in this small religious community where families are forever, and Mormon families do genuinely believe that families become sealed in the temple, and then the afterlife, they're reunited as a family. So they believe that it truly is this sacred family bond. And even though she's not Mormon, that attitude permeates the community and this belief that families are forever. It's written on the walls in, murals and in, portraits when you go into family homes. So she's constantly has this message. And I think for the longest time, it doesn't even enter her head that exiting the marriage is a possibility. She can't even acknowledge that. So not having that, even as an option, she just keeps trying harder and harder. And she thinks, no, if I make the effort and work with Kyle, this will get better. And she makes a lot of excuses saying, oh, the house is very, very stressful. But once the house is finished, surely things will get better once the house is finished. Surely things will get better once, my second is in school and there's a little less pressure. And so she keeps kind of moving the goalposts of if I just keep pushing and doing my best. And I think, returning to your question, I think that does manifest itself in she just loves her children so fiercely. And she turns to her children as a source of refuge in this family and this marriage that is falling apart, but her children are there. And her relationship with the children is incredibly strong.
In addition to the gift of a sewing machine, Kyle also supplies a copy of the Mormon Wives Monthly for Meg to peruse. Now, that doesn't quite seem to be the reading material that Meg wants or needs. So Meg begins attending a book group that is supposed to, I suppose, realign her values with those of the Mormons. But what does Meg find in this book group?
Mormon Wives Monthly is not a real periodical, as far as I know. I made that up as a bit of a humor. I guess the heart of why Meg is pushed into the Mormon book club begins when she asks to go back to school. So what she's asked her husband is, I would like to go back to school. Hallie's turning 3. We don't have a baby at home anymore. This would be very fulfilling for me. And he says, you don't need that. And so he pushes her into this Mormon book club as, oh, you read books at university, you read books in a book club. Surely that's the same thing. And so, yeah, he pushes her into this Mormon book club. And I think he thinks that it's going to be this nice, safe, cozy, submissive space for her. These other women are going to act as role models as to how to be, a good wife and how to be happy with your domestic life of childcare and homemaking. And I mean, I don't know if you've sat in many book clubs, but book clubs are anything but that. Usually the books being discussed, it's probably about 15-20% of the time spent at book club. And the rest is chatting, talking about wider societal problems, talking about politics, talking about anything and everything. And it's this safe space where, women can just be annoyed at the things in life and everybody gets it. And I was part of a Mormon book club, actually. I went back home after university and I lived at home for a few years saving up and working as a cover teacher. And I participated in a book club, and I know a lot of the women in there would not describe themselves as intellectual, or at least I don't think they would. But the kind of the topics that they were wrestling with about, autonomy and depending on the book we were reading, some really kind of deep philosophical concepts and societal problems. And, it became very clear that maybe they weren't using the, industry terms for things, but they were grappling with these big ideas and we were really discussing them and what should be done. So yeah, Kyle pushes Meg into this book club and thinks it's going to be, yes, how to be a good wife in training. And it's not, it's just opening up her world even further. And they're reading these very interesting, wide variety of books. And she also forges a friendship with a fellow mother in the group. And that's something else that Meg was really lacking. Kyle had sort of been slowly isolating her from others. And anybody that Meg had been friends with in high school had gone off to go to university and do other things. So, at the beginning, I guess at the beginning of her and Kyle's relationship, she was incredibly isolated and alone. And throughout the novel and joining this book club, she's kind of slowly building her network back.
The story is also told through a series of shifting timelines, and this is, I guess, where we find the real Meg, and Meg quite different to the one we're finding in St. Stephen's. Who was Meg before Kyle, Finn, and Hallie?
Yeah, there are little snapshots and glimpses back to that. Um, Speaking a little bit of writer and craft to speak, I set myself a rule that I wasn't allowed to use flashbacks in the first draft because I wanted to try to illuminate the past through hints in the present to make it a little more intriguing. I did have to add some flashbacks to, illuminate that a bit more. But I did have a cutoff point. So anything that is pre-pregnancy, so Meg's first pregnancy with Finn, which was an accident, anything before that time is told through bedtime stories to Finn. And anything past that, pregnancy into present, is actually told through a more traditional flashback where see what happened. Meg was a very, very, very vivacious, academic, kind of driven, tough. She's the youngest of four, and she has three older brothers. So she kind of had to grow up a bit rough and tumble. And she's got this fantastic kind of snarky, spirited kind of voice that I loved inhabiting. I absolutely loved writing this book and kind of stepping into Meg's shoes and the way that she'll find humor and kind of snark back at situations in her head. And even some of the things she says in person are a little more gutsy than I think I would say.
This book explores quite a number of themes, important themes around women's lives, autonomy, especially around childbearing, but also this idea of coercive control. But then you also bring in these wider concepts that give us a fairly unique insight to American life, culture, and politics. And time-wise, we're in this Barack Obama, Mitt Romney era, where things are changing in America. We've got this interesting idea of the freedom to believe or not to believe, as Meg does, coupled with this idea of freedom of speech. Are these divisions in American life something that preoccupies you as an author?
I think that setting a novel in contemporary America, it is impossible not to touch on the sort of political backdrop. It's not something that features heavily in the book, but it was something that in a very later stage in the novel, I was reading it and I went, there's just something that doesn't feel completely grounded here. There's something that's missing a little bit, and I could not figure out what it was. And then I realized I had absolutely zero reference to contemporary political news, any sort of events. And those sort of, even if they're mentioned in passing, it can give the reader will fill in the gaps in the story with what they know about that era or what they know about that particular president. And it can be, I think, very useful to contextualize what's going on. The Barack Obama Mitt Romney election was a particularly interesting one to view in the context of this community because Mitt Romney is Mormon, and it's the first time that a Mormon LDS presidential candidate was actually up and running for election. So the entire community was full tilt behind Mitt. He represents our way of life, and I think something else that's important to remember is this is only a couple of years before Trump was then elected. And so this is sort of the kind of tensions and dissatisfaction. I think when Obama was reelected, there was a lot of kind of anger in small conservative communities and feeling like, oh, here we are, we're here for another, 4-year term with a president that they didn't agree with and didn't connect with. And there's definitely some racism as well contributing to that. But it is interesting sort of viewing the book now versus if I tried to write it at that moment, it would represent something different. But knowing where the United States political sphere and the events that happened, after that, knowing that now, the book does have a different meaning.
Let's return to the skeleton house, a half-built house, a symbol of a dream yet to be fulfilled. Not so much for Meg, but perhaps for Kyle. But it's also suggestive of, I guess, what we might call skeletons in the closet.
Yes.
Is the skeleton house, the title, somehow emblematic of those secrets within this family?
I think so. As I, progressed writing the book, the skeleton house, like the house itself, almost became a character. It is in the very first, image, in chapter 1, is she's staring up at the house and the framing of the house has been erected. It really is a skeleton house. It looks like a skeleton, and it's just the timber framing. And slowly, those skeleton parts become covered up by the house itself, but she always knows that there is a skeleton there. And there's a lot of imagery and description about the way she feels walking into it, and that she feels like she's Jonah from the Bible, and this is a whale that has swallowed her whole. And that's how she feels when she moves into the house. And there are these sort of kind of odd things that happen, doors kind of open, and she just never feels settled in this house. She feels like there's something very wrong with it. And I think that that does speak to the wider issues that are happening within the relationship and within the marriage, that Meg's not been able to admit to herself what is actually happening in her marriage, and that Kyle is being extremely controlling, progressively more and more controlling and abusive as the book continues. And she's not admitting it to herself, and her imagination or subconscious sort of telling her that this house is bad news and she is stuck in the house. And it definitely becomes this, reflective of what's happening in the relationship.
Katherine Allum, it's been a great pleasure to talk to you, and thank you for joining me on the Good Reading Podcast.
Thank you so much for having me.
I've been talking to Katherine Allum about her debut novel, The Skeleton House. It's published by Fremantle Press, and you can find it at goodreadingmagazine.com.au. My name's Greg Dobbs, and thanks for listening. This Good Reading Podcast was brought to you by Book People Gift Cards. Share the joy of reading with a Book People gift card. To find out more, visit bookpeoplegiftcards.org.au.